Russian President Vladimir Putin once proclaimed the dissolution of the Soviet Empire as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. But then came Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Concerns are now rising among European nations that Putin could expand his offensive further into Europe over the coming decade, and they might have to face his forces without US support. In an interview with The Times, Lieutenant General Alexander Solfrank, the commander of NATO's military logistics center in southwest Germany, urged allies to steel itself for potential Russian strikes on targets across Europe, including in Germany. Other generals from the United States and the Netherlands are also worried that in this scenario, the Russian would strike deep behind their front lines on the civilian and military infrastructure. However, these warnings are partly based on the war in Ukraine, where Russia has launched heavy air and missile strikes well away from the battle lines. In retaliation, the Ukrainians have also knocked out ammunition dumps, command posts, and fuel depots hundreds of miles into Russian-occupied territory. Meanwhile, over the weekend, German newspaper Bild reported that Germany's armed forces had already started planning for the eventuality of Russian cyber attacks and sabotage against German targets. The document outlined a potential path to conflict between Russia and the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance. However, specific data on the number and movements of NATO troops are withheld for security reasons. On the other hand, the Ukrainian president is fearing the Ukrainian conflict will escalate into a third world war if Russian aggression is not contained with support from Kyiv's Western allies. He also urged Germany to use its economic heft to gather more support for Ukraine amid the prospects of potentially diminishing military aid from the US due to Republican objections in the Congress. Matthew Drawn is a visiting fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He is now joining us live from Washington, D.C. Mr. Drawn, thank you very much for making time for us, and welcome to WION World is One.
Thanks for having me.
Are the concerns raised by European nations that Putin could expand his offensive further into Europe over the coming decade justified? Is there a possibility that even that could happen?
Well, if we're talking over the coming decades, yes, certainly this is something that, at least if you're a sound military planner, you have to think about and prepare. Now, on the short term, I think this is less likely. I mean, if you're a rational decision maker in Moscow, although we have seen some irrational decisions in the past, but if you're already struggling to maintain the front line with the Ukrainians, I'm not sure you really want to involve NATO and its military power into the conflict. You'd rather probably seek diversion or distraction, and maybe targets softer, let's say softer targets or weaker countries in the vicinity of Ukraine, such as Moldova or Georgia. But yeah, on the short term, I don't see any extension of the conflict. There's been let's say, tacit understanding between the West and Russia that the West would not directly target Russia and that Russia would not directly target NATO countries to keep escalation under control for both sides.
Mr. Drawn, now that you've mentioned the military, what could have been the stoking factor or for this worry or fear among generals and also the military alliance of NATO? What could have caused that worry?
Well, I think you don't really, I mean, you can look east, but you should also look west if you're European. And of course, the rising prospect of Donald Trump being elected as the new president of the United States, given its previous statements on NATO specifically and on the war in Ukraine, saying that he would solve the issue in 24 hours, or his previous comments that he would pull out of NATO, that it doesn't feel that the US has to get involved to protect European allies and partners. I think this is probably the main factor that raises fears, or at least that European capitals are now coming to terms of the fact that they might have to handle the security of the continent by themselves in the coming years, and we're talking the elections are in November this year, so this is not a so far away future. So I guess this also helps European capitals to think about what should be their responsibility, how they can be prepared for a scenario, because of course the fact that NATO is weakened would change the Russia's calculus, and although it might not precipitate Russia to attack NATO, I'm sure it will. I mean, certainly, if you're a Russian decision maker, it would make NATO less deterrent, probably.
Okay, if that's the case, what can the so-called vulnerable nations in Europe and also the Baltics do to avoid or even avert an imminent conflict with Russia?
Well, at least the Baltic states have been the most prepared and the most aware of the Russian threat, and they have been warning the rest of Europe for years. And so they are still, I mean, small countries, but they have harnessed the NATO framework to be reinforced, to be reassured. So you have now tactical groups that are deployed under the enhanced forward presence of NATO in those states and in other Eastern European countries. Now you're seeing also the biggest military exercise from NATO being deployed in several parts of Europe, from the north to the east, with up to 90,000 troops. It's called the Steadfast Defender 2024. Plus NATO has adopted some what they call the regional plans to adapt to the new threats posed by Russia and others to Europe. So, I mean, NATO has been searching for its purpose for the past 2 decades, but now that Russia is on the war footing, it's really back focused on the Russian threat. And so there's a lot going on, of course, not publicly, but from the military planners are fully hand on deck.
All right, I've been talking to Matthew Dron, who is a visiting fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Dron, thank you very much for talking to WION World is One today.
Thanks to you. Thanks for having me.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.